Anand, thank you very much indeed. Let's go to our panel. Joining me here in the studio is Paulo Sotero. He is the director of the Brazil Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Also with us from Beijing is Chinese international relations expert Victor Gao. And with us here in Washington, too, is Anton Fedyashin. He is associate professor of history at American University. He specializes in Eurasian and international relations. Welcome to you all. I want to try and concentrate, if I can, on the message coming out of this summit and throwing forward to the next one, which is in 2018 in South Africa. And also President Xi's call for greater global governance. A second golden decade, he called it. Victor Gao in Beijing, with those words, a second golden decade ringing in your ears. What was your takeaway from this summit so far?
First of all, I think this BRICS Summit happened, and it happened with a big bang. And President Xi Jinping and other BRICS leaders not only looked backward over the first 10 years, but also forecasted into the future. And at this particular moment, I think the world needs more voices from the emerging markets, and the BRICS framework really creates a leadership role for all the developing countries. And in the world today, not only in terms of trade and economic relations, but also in political relations, the emerging markets headed by the BRICS 5 countries can play a more constructive role, not only in promoting trade and economic relations, but also in global governance. And this is really a new challenge for BRICS going forward in the next 10 years.
Well, President Xi wanted to set the tone going forward, and he certainly seems to have done that. Paulo, Brazil is having very difficult times economically, politically at the moment. Many analysts saw this event for Brazil as really a sales pitch because there's no inward investment going on in Brazil at the moment, or very limited. And Brazil is looking for, some say, $10 billion over a number of years to come in from overseas. Did you see anything or hear anything over the course of this weekend that would be of real benefit to Brazil going forward in the immediate future?
Well, John, Chinese investment in Brazil, actually, it's coming in. The problem is that Brazil is not ready yet to fully use those opportunities. Brazil needs to undergo a profound domestic reform in a very difficult moment. Brazil has needed that for years. Brazil now faces its most serious domestic crisis in history. I personally believe Brazil is going to come out of that a much better country because it faces its problems economically, politically. It's very complex. I think I see the summit, obviously, as a moment of affirmation of Chinese leadership being very well used by the leadership there. Brazil has to do. John, nobody can help Brazil before Brazil helps itself. We have been at this. I think I am confident that the next government to be elected in Brazil in October of 2018 will have an opportunity to address those issues. That's what Brazilians want. The BRICS now provide a very nice diplomatic elevator, but not much more than that. But we can see China affirming its leadership, especially in the absence of the United States that decided to take a vacation on that.
And Paulo, is it true that for Brazil, the more members, the better? Because you're looking for as much foreign investment as you could possibly get. And so therefore, you know, to go beyond even the BRICS plus 5 would be good for Brazil.
You know, Brazil is one of those fundamental major nations that if we do what we have to do at home, the policies that will attract people, it doesn't really matter what is the format. It matters that Brazil, you know, offers so many opportunities. We have not have the resources so far. For instance, infrastructure. I have been to China a few times. What China did in 15 years, Brazil is taking, what, 50? The need to improve infrastructure is there. But in the last time we were thinking about that, we were we thought that we were really investing in that. We actually were involved in a major corruption scandal. So
Yes.
people are recovering from that, but the opportunities for investment are there. And it's not true that Brazil is not attracting investment. Brazil attracted this year so far.
But it's down.
But it's down. But it's 72 billion
yes.
for the year.
Anton Fedyashin, there are so many similarities, aren't there, between all these BRICS member nations. A lot of what Paulo has just said could be applied in some respects to almost any of them. Now, the issue that the Russians have, of course, is that they have sanctions against them at the moment from the United States and from the United Nations. Membership of BRICS offers an end to isolation for Moscow. Did you see and hear anything this weekend that is music to your ears?
I am just back from 3 months in Russia, and just to correct you, there are no UN sanctions on Russia. There are European and United States, Western sanctions on Russia. What is remarkable about Russia is that the doldrums that follow the sanctions are pretty much over. The consumer market is rebounding, which has taken most people by surprise. And despite the very tough economic situation in which Russia is, which is a combination of sanctions and the cutting off of Russian access to Western capital markets, plus the collapse in oil prices, the Russian economy is slated to grow by between 2 and 2.8%, depending on whose figures you believe. That is a miracle all of its own, given the immense pressure under which the Russians are operating. The collapse of the ruble has stimulated exports from Russia because they are cheaper than everything else. And this actually allows the Russians to support the Chinese call for greater global trade, because as we know from history, and I'm an historian, it's countries that profit from open markets that always push for them first and foremost. Right. No country has ever actually been a completely open market in history, neither the British in the 19th century nor the Americans in the 20th, or today. Everyone has some form of tariff or subsidies at home. The agricultural business in the United States is very heavily subsidized. But the Russians are now together with the Chinese in terms of open markets, because it favors them. Agriculture is booming in Russia because of the counter-sanctions that the Russians imposed, and now the agricultural market is compensating for the fall in imports from the West. So Russia is developing. The BRICS have become, for Russia, even more importantly than economic partners, geopolitical partners, because there is a massive tectonic geopolitical shift going on in the world, and the Chinese and the Russians are at the forefront of movement to de-Westernize global politics. This is after 3 centuries, no less, 3 centuries of Western dominance.
Well, that was really what I meant by the comment of ending your isolation, because you've got the European sanctions and the US sanctions. You can't turn there, but you can turn to the BRICS nations, or rather Russia can turn to the BRICS nations, right?
Absolutely, among not only the BRICS.
Yeah.